Hello, and welcome to Mutual Exchange Radio. This is Alex McHugh, and today's episode features my interview with John Cavanaugh of the digital privacy organization, the Plunk Foundation. John is Executive Director and Privacy Evangelist at the Plunk Foundation, where his role is to provide executive leadership and work directly and collaboratively with the Board of Directors to establish the vision and direction of the Plunk Foundation. John has spent the past 10 years helping college students, veterans, and professionals connect through various grant opportunities and university affiliations. The Plunk Foundation is dedicated to promoting digital data privacy for women, children, and marginalized communities. Their mission is to bridge the gap between those who have access to digital privacy tools and knowledge and those who do not. They strive to empower individuals and communities so they have autonomy over their digital identities and the ability to protect sensitive information. So with that, hello, John, and welcome to Mutual Exchange Radio.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for hosting me. I really appreciate it and look forward to diving in with you.
Yeah, of course. I think this is going to be a really great conversation. And I'm going to start with some pretty basic questions. I'm not a super online person, which is kind of funny. I think a lot of the people at Center for a Stateless Society, a lot of our listeners are much more familiar with data privacy, digital security than I am. But that said, I can see the importance of this subject to anyone interested in human freedom and human flourishing. And for those of us at C4SS, some privacy issues are front and center a lot of the time. So we have a lot of people who write about mass surveillance and privacy as it relates to state repression.
Right.
But the sort of deeper issue of consent, as it extends to one's digital life, is something our community will really be concerned about and interested in hearing more about as well.
Excellent.
Yeah, so to get right into it, can you first tell us a little bit about your organization, the Plunk Foundation, and what motivated you to take on this digital divide in data privacy?
Yeah, thanks. So the Plunk Foundation is an acronym. It stands for Peaceful, Loving, Uplifting, Nurturing, and Kind. And it was actually born out of a venture that I started in college where I built a website and the entire goal of it was to get college students together. I was 19 and I wanted to be a doctor. And in the United States, to do so, you have to go through about 8 years of school, 2 years of residency, and it's extremely, extremely expensive. So I wanted to build a website where I could connect with people to figure out if I wanted to go to med school and see what their journey was looking like when they applied for the, it's called MCATs in the United States, and to get into med school, and if they even liked med school, all those types of things. But I made it agnostic that anybody could join. We did really well, and we ended up having like 10,000 people in the first month or so that joined. I got a ton of grants to keep it alive. Eventually became a product where we built an app and sold it to universities and worked with universities on helping them increase their retention rate. And as we got to this venture, we needed a lot of funding to keep up. And that's where investors informed us that the only way they would invest, even though we had a good business model and we had good growth, was if we collected, which we didn't collect any, but collected mass data on the students. And the reasoning was that in the United States, students go into debt to go to college, and they get a lump sum of money every semester, and a lot of students spend that money on, frivolous things, their relationships, pizza and beer on Fridays, and it's at 10% interest, like those types of things. And since they have poor financial literacy and feel stress often, that pushing ads to this demographic would make them buy more in times of stress. And that felt really wrong to my team, and we decided to abandon the project because we couldn't keep it up anymore. And out of that became the basis for a nonprofit when we looked at how can we build sustainable technology that's ethical. And we looked at, in the US, you have an article of incorporation for a nonprofit that cannot be changed. The fundamentals cannot be changed. And the government has to regulate that it is completing its mission. So we liked that model, at least to start, when we build technology that can be open source and freely available to everybody that works in the privacy field. So the Plunk Foundation works on awareness, education, technology, and tools that provide assistance to individuals and a lot of organizations that are looking to enhance their privacy.
Wow. Well, so first of all, props for, being in that situation and saying, no, we're not going to turn over all of this data. I don't think it's many, business owners, app developers who are willing to do that and say, no, we have, 10,000 people using this product, but we're not going to do that. That's really amazing.
Yeah, Alex, it was a lot more than that by that time.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So yeah, it was something that was interesting because I had mentors and lots of people that are like, "Hey, just take the money," because it was frankly enough to retire, honestly.
Mhm.
Like, hey, just take this money and do something altruistic with it later. But it just was like, how can you sleep at night taking that? I don't know. Maybe I was just how I was raised or something like that. But I'm glad that my team actually felt the same way. There was no argument. It wasn't even like a big decision. It was just like, meh. Okay, let's do something else.
Well, we're not going to do this. Yeah. No, it's
Yeah,
interesting. You'll you'll probably notice we actually never run ads on our podcasts, and
yeah.
we haven't done really any paid ads ever for
I've noticed
social
that.
SS. And people often ask us like, you would be able to get so many more donations. Why don't you do it? And it's just, we don't want to interact with that whole ecosystem.
Yeah, and once you start, it only gets more aggressive.
Mm.
Like you're kind of cornered into doing more, because once you have that revenue stream, you're gonna want to keep, pumping that up. There's something called, it's kind of funny. It's called the law of shitty click-throughs that, eventually people stop clicking on the same types of advertisements, and then you need to be more sophisticated and, all those types of things. So it's probably a mess you want to avoid.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm interested, you mentioned the various aspects of Plunk Foundation's work, whether it be, you said education, tools, technology. I'm
Mhm.
particularly interested to get into some of this technology a little bit later.
Yeah,
But first, I wanted to kind of take a step back and
sure.
talk about where things are right now. So I
Hmm.
found the TED Talk, I think it was Fred Kate, you have posted on the Plunk Foundation homepage.
Yeah.
I found that pretty informative looking at the current state of privacy policy and the issues involved,
Hmm.
particularly this failure of our standard privacy notices and related regulations to actually obtain real informed consent from consumers.
Hmm.
And it seems like your focus is largely on the inaccessibility of privacy for
Right.
people who are in low income communities or otherwise are marginalized.
Yeah.
So, next, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the ways in which our current privacy practices and regulations leave people behind or
Mhm.
fail to ensure data privacy in general.
Yeah. So Alex, you're in Europe, right?
No, I'm actually in the US as well.
Oh, okay. Got it. Cool. Yeah. So the first thing that I want to say is in the EU, they have the GDPR, which is essentially a federal law that protects privacy. Now, there are enormous flaws to it, but it's way better than anything we have in the US. In the US, this is the philosophical thing. In the US, your privacy or your data is considered an asset, meaning that you trade it for value. You may trade this for a discount at a store, your phone number that you give away, your email address. We see this all the time. Um, you trade it for all various conveniences. If you're using an app or something along those lines that uses your location, you're giving permissions to something, and it's a free app, right? But what you're doing is you're exchanging your data. Now, In Europe, there are some protections for the human side of things. In the United States, California has mimicked a lot of Europe's progressive parts on this. We're seeing this in other areas too. So Colorado, Virginia, there's New York has really, because they're a financial institution or financial behemoth, they have um, stricter laws with their financial institutions. But at the end of the day, it's a patchwork, and there's not a collective consensus in the US at all about what privacy should be. For example, I was reviewing, I live in Ohio, and there's a House bill that just got passed. It's called House Bill 15 for Kentucky that I was asked to review. And as we saw it, there were several different versions and drafts that I was looking at. And the one that got passed was the least strict. And it's because businesses are incentivized to, lobby against types of bills like this. So you have a lot of pushback. And the reason why businesses don't want this is because the data that is aggregated is very valuable. And this allows them to better target ads. And the data that's collected online can be bought and sold and traded sort of like a stock broker. And there are things called data brokers that collect information. And what happens is it all bubbles up to the top two or three. So on average, there's I forget the exact number, but on average, each person has 3,184 data points that are on them. And these can be extremely specific to target ads, including location data, health data, um, relationship status, all kinds of things.
Wow, yeah, I think probably our listeners think about this more than I do, all of the different data points that get recorded on us every single day.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes a lot of sense that in the US it would be, we consider these things assets, we consider these tradable goods.
Right.
And it, is one of the things I think, like you were saying earlier, once you start taking that money, it kind of drives everything. And it's one of the things we see in the US a lot is that, our regulations are largely defined by business interests. Our, decision making comes from a sort of predetermined place that is determined by these business interests and not by what you might call public welfare.
Right.
Definitely a big problem. And so I want to dig into this a little bit more. You're just talking about, there's 3,000 something data points on most people.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like a lot of the issues that we're most concerned about rise from this sort of inferred data about groups of people, which, the way I see it, it could be easy for this inferred data to lead to the sort of systematic bias and discrimination
Right.
that can cause a lot of problems for people. So the next question I want to ask is, how does this issue of the inferred data and systematic bias, how does this impact people in the real world? And what are the risks of failing to provide equity in data privacy?
Yeah, that's a good point. And that could be an entire podcast itself, just to be very frank with you. But so can you be a little more specific about what you mean with inferred data, please?
Yeah, so what I mean by that is when we're looking at how someone, acts online, how they purchase things, either inferring a social group from that
Mm-hmm.
or inferring particular activities, interests, etc., that we might assume they have based on belonging to a certain social group, right? Based on income, class, based on race, based on, these categories that, when we create laws or, do other things, these are protected classes.
Right.
But these are also classes that advertisers, right, data brokers use all the time in ways that I can see. I can see being harmful, right?
Right, right. So yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you for clarifying. Appreciate it. So there are a lot of implications across a broad range of spectrums. So I will give a concrete example that can help. And it's actually on the EFF website, which is called the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They are a pretty awesome group of lawyers and policy suggestion makers that um, also take cases for people who have been victims of surveillance and big tech related stuff. One thing that, and I think that's something that a lot of people relate to as well. So one thing that's been very worrisome is this act of proactive policing. If you're familiar with the concept, but it's the whole thing is to stop crime before it happens. And they use predictive models. This model was invented in the US, actually, the predictive policing was, and it's spread to other countries. But a lot of it relies on technology to identify where crime might be at certain times of the day or year, based on previous data of where crime is. And Alex, I'm sure you know that the neighborhoods that um, have protected groups and a lot of marginalized communities are often surveilled more heavily. So what happens is that there is this self-fulfilling prophecy of um, these police officers who have technology in their car, and it literally will say things like, "Hey, I suggest you go in this area, these blocks at 2 in the morning," as an example. And what this does is it actually primes violence because police officers are expecting crime to happen. So if they see a bunch of people hanging out outside of a bar at 2 a.m., it's no problem. But if there's something that says, "Hey, you need to look out for crime in this block," at 2 a.m. and there's a bar there, the police officer is going to be very suspicious, possibly aggressive, and then may like stop for misdemeanors that they normally wouldn't stop for, like if they smell weed smoke, as an example. And so this predictive policing, then let's say the cop writes a ticket or there's a violent behavior that they settle and they, quote unquote, stop crime before it happens. Then that's another bullet point in the system that says, oh yes, it confirms, yes, there was crime here. It's good that we police this area, as an example. And then what you have is data that stacks up with heavier policing suggested in certain areas to quote unquote stop crime before it happens. And then this community is constantly policed when they don't necessarily need to be. And then when you look at other areas of crime, that that are happening, in suburban neighborhoods, as an example, there's a lot less policing going on. So you'll find that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in that way. So that's a more of a predictive model in policing. Now, the thing that's really popular right now is everybody goes and talks about artificial intelligence, and the bias that exists in there. We've seen lots of examples. Google had that terrible, diversity and inclusion infused into everything, that showed Black Hitler and all kinds of stuff. And those are, in my opinion, a lot of those are sort of gimmicky, where it's like, yeah, like this wasn't put together very well. And when we look at it, you can see that there were no social scientists that were really involved to ask those types of questions. And there are lack of, it's very hardcore science that um, supposes that the internet is inherently neutral instead of an extension of the biases that already exist in society. So we're seeing a lot of that with AI, and that can have a variety of implications. AI is really involved in like health data. There are a lot of healthcare companies and health tech companies that are looking for cancers, as an example, and different groups have different, emphasis on certain anatomy sometimes. And, you know, um, skin color, as an example, can is still really hard on cameras to adjust. So there are various things that can cause a wide variety of ramifications. That's just two categories.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the predictive policing one is really poignant. Some of the very real harm that can come from this sort of thing. And it's one that I think a lot of our listeners will be familiar with as a very serious problem.
Hmm.
What I was thinking about while you were going through some of these examples was the sort of extreme case in China where they're considering, or maybe have already started to implement the like social credit score,
Yeah,
um, which you know scares me quite a bit.
totally.
Um, but I also, in talking about this before we started the recording, you mentioned something about, there aren't a lot of devs who know philosophy, who are involved with the social sciences. And then you also mentioned when some of these AI projects are being put together, there's no social scientist on board. So
Mhm.
I'm wondering if there's more you'd want to say about what value there is in having the social sciences involved in tech decisions and in development.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I looked at this myself within our organization, and we have about 30 professors from the University of Cincinnati, and others from other areas. But a good, what I venture to say, half or maybe even more than half of them are either in sociology or communications or women's gender and sexuality studies. And the reason is because I would say there's this really cool book by I forget who the author is. Benjamin is the last name, but it's called The Race After Technology, and it talks about how we tend to believe that science is sterile and that just like the pure answers come as a result of the investigations. And essentially, what that does is the scientists themselves, they have their bias and they have their angles. So it's not completely, and we are, you know, science science worshipers. A lot of us are, but we don't see the cracks behind the bias that occurs, like how an article gets published, who are the people that are publishing articles, and how do they have access. And the more educated people tend to skew towards a white male, as an example, that have PhDs. And so there's a lot of this underneath that's a little bit messy that people fail to understand. And that's especially true when it comes to technology. People think that, for example, Facebook and Facebook's algorithm are just showing things that people like. But no, the way it's infused and the way that it's built in, and you'll see this with ChatGPT, is that there is a lens to everything. And we need to be aware of that lens and how it affects us. So when we look at this problem, we do need people who understand basic levels of philosophy, who understand basic levels of questions that they can ask to say, hey, I understand we're doing this. How does it affect these groups of people? What is the impact that this has? And so when we look at people who design and build things, a lot of times they're incredible artists. But the step back that a lot of technologists need to take is, how is this humane? There's a really awesome organization called the Society for Humane Technology. And there's also the Signal Foundation, which goes by a lot of these tenets, and the EFF and the Mozilla Foundation. And a lot of them are really advocating for people who understand the impact of the tools that they are building. However, it's very tempting. A lot of startups are pretty much salespeople who find an idea and they hire people overseas to make that idea. And they're using American cash in, like, let's say, an Indian market as an example. So there's a lot of cash flow to interact with that business. And a lot of these people are just seeing an idea and going for it as an American dream, as an example. But what's happening is you have this system where you have an opportunist who's looking to make a bunch of money and then has the supply of developers who don't care what the project is because they're just getting US dollars, as an example. And that cycle is really hard to break because developers are expensive that think deeply like this. And adding a social scientist, as an example, may be considered an extra cost that, isn't doable right now. And maybe we'll get to it later after we've already built everything. But that's not inclusive technology. That's not a way to actually build something that looks for protected communities first. And so that's how the cycle kind of begins that I've seen.
Yeah, I pulled it up. Race After Technology. The author is Ruha Benjamin.
Yep, Ruhasa. There we go.
Yeah, this looks really interesting. I will probably read it at some point soon.
It's really good, and it's good. It's good in layman terms. Like it's not like
Mm,
overly technical, so anybody could read it, and regardless of their technical background.
nice. Yeah, and I see what you're saying about it being really difficult to go back and sort of inject concern for humanity, for human rights into things. Just looking at how Facebook has developed, right? And
Mhm.
people saying now, well, we need to fix the algorithm to do X, Y, and Z, but it's so ingrained and it's been developed over so many years that how can you possibly do that at this point?
Yeah, and more importantly, like how can you well, Zuckerberg's lucky where he has board seats and like he has some voting rights, but like people that invest in it, um, let's say Zuckerberg goes in a direction that's more sustainable, you're going to likely lose profits in the short term, but maybe long term it will be sustainable, right? But those short-term profits are often demanded of you if you're a publicly traded company. And so let's give Zuckerberg benefit of the doubt and say he's the most altruistic person who's been trying to change this for the last 20 years or whatever. Let's just give him that benefit of the doubt. It's still really, really hard when you have this public eye that's looking at every earnings result for every quarter, as an example, and you receive all of these pressures to sell out in that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that'll resonate with a lot of our listeners. I mean, being market anarchists, right?
Yeah.
A lot of the things we look at are the ways in which this short-term profit-driven economy makes companies worse.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
with you.
yeah. So, given all of that, we've looked a lot at the problems.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if there's anything out there that you see as sort of a viable solution in the works right now. Are there any practices or rules that you think are working, or at least are providing movement sort of in the right direction on the issue of digital privacy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there are decent amount of pockets of organizations, but Alex, I have to be honest, it's definitely going to get worse. Definitely going to get worse before it's better. Um, the idea, though, is that the Plunk Foundation and others are prepared, and we kind of know where this is going, and we kind of see where this is going. But we need to we are raising alarms and we are educating people, and that's where awareness really comes in. I believe that when you hear mostly about privacy, you look it up. They use the word consumer, like consumer privacy, but I don't like that term because it just reduces a person to their buying power, and it also doesn't affect the family. Like let's say one person works and they're a consumer and they're buying things, but it doesn't mention like the family or the grandparents that they're taking care of and things like that. So when I'm looking at this and seeing the movement, I do believe that right now the laws are focused on this consumerism mentality rather than individuals and families and people that are actually impacted and affected by this. So the education needs to be immensely ramped up of people understanding that privacy really is a human right and that it's currently an asset here, and we have the ability to change that as people. And that's the only way I believe that it can trickle up into social change. It can trickle up into policy, into, companies will adjust if people demand your private, like to have privacy, as an example. So the laws are slowly coming together, too, in the United States. And there's actually a bill that is looking to get passed. I know it's an election year, so I don't have much hope. And I also don't think it's that great of one, but it is a federal privacy um, law that is looking to be enacted in the US. Now, just the fact that it's coming through this early shocked me and shocked many other experts because we didn't feel like the US would even remotely consider this. So that's been really good. One thing is also the Biden administration has raised alarms as a national emergency that there's not enough cybersecurity experts in our businesses and stuff. So they are funding people to have more cybersecurity to protect from international interests, which I find very interesting because cybersecurity is for those that need some clarity on this. The cybersecurity is, for example, locking the doors in your house so people don't get in. And anything related to privacy is essentially like closing your blinds so people aren't peeking in and observing everything you're doing. And both are important. So I've noticed the Biden administration has at least carefully looked at technology and how it's affecting people and are proposing some solutions. Now, I don't think it's at all enough, but that start has actually surprised me that the US is going for it. The big worry, though, is with AI being a wild west, what we're seeing is that privacy violations is inherent in AI. Like it's literally scraping data, which some countries have ruled is unconstitutional or illegal to scrape so much data, even if it's public domain. But there's so much data that's being collected without overt consent, really. Like, hey, this AI model just like took all of these, like The Economist and Wall Street Journal and all these lawsuits that you're seeing. Um, and so with all of that data and paying $20 a month, people can really train models based on invasive things that have already been collected. And we're not really sure how AI can use these things. One A lot of things we've seen is like, you know, with the Taylor Swift incident that happened in February, is you can take somebody's images. You can also do this with voice or video. You just need a little bit, and you can immediately taint something. So not only is it what our sense of truth might be, but we can invade people's privacy based on not even, based on made up stuff or little simple data points, and we can sway things. So how to stop that is very interesting. And there's been some proposed solutions, but we're really worried about what this means for families and children. Like how do we protect people when all of this data has been scooped up already and can be used at will, or cameras now have AI and can identify you? Is there a world where there is actually is privacy in this advent of AI becoming so popular and ubiquitous?
Wow, yeah, it's interesting. I think we've heard a lot about the problems of AI as it relates to like intellectual property, like artists being upset that their work is being scraped.
Right.
That's something that folks at C4SS tend to fall on the tend to oppose intellectual property as a concept, or
Hmm.
don't think it's something that we should care very much about protecting.
Hmm.
But I hadn't actually thought about the dangers of just the invasiveness of in general of it scooping up all of this data from individuals without their consent and us not knowing how it could possibly be used, right?
Yeah, and Alex, I want to comment on that because I think that's how America tends to think is like you mentioned, you're thinking in terms of, buying power and consumerism. But the real danger that I'm trying to set the alarms for is like, no, this actually hurts families and children. Like we can take business out of the equation, and let's say, there are, who like we take entirely like, how can AI help build a better society? And my answer is like, hey, I don't know, but it seems like there's a ton of harm that can come from this. And we're already seeing bad actors being a part of this. And it's something that everybody should, if you know somebody or like somebody, it's something you should be concerned about?
Right. If you don't live by yourself in a cave.
Right.
Wow.
Sounds
So,
tempting, though.
yeah, I moved from the city of Philadelphia to the woods a
Cool.
couple years ago. So,
That's what's up.
yeah. Um, so with all of that, the next thing I want to talk about, and you mentioned this a little bit already, some of the other organizations y'all work with, um, but it seems like Plunk Foundation works with a variety of community partners, and I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about those partnerships and what the sort of general landscape of advocacy looks like in the data privacy world.
Yeah, so Alex, I do want to mention it just as a preface that we are a young organization. We're getting started and we are building those partnerships out. So as we're doing so, the first thing that we looked at is, well, we need to be attached to an academic institution because we need to make sure we have the social scientists in there. We need to make sure we have people who are technologically renowned. There's so much talent in Cincinnati and at the University of Cincinnati, and there's very siloed, right? So like a social scientist isn't necessarily talking to somebody who does English as a second language classes. And so the way we thought about this is that how do we break these silos and create an interdisciplinary approach that also helps the university when they are looking to give students experiences. So we're working with various teams that are professor led. And a lot of these professors have centers or labs. So some of their job is literally working in a lab that does community outreach, and they teach maybe one class a year, but their primary goal is doing outreach. There are some that are part of the law school, like Jen Dye, who's on our board, who studies social justice, women's and gender studies in the context of law, and has a center there that helps lawyers see things from that angle. And her job is to raise awareness and saying, hey, if you have cases that you need help with in these areas, we can help you and help students understand cases from that lens. So what we've done is we've put together pretty much an all-star team of these incredible people who have been working on very hardcore research or community outreach. And we've then gone into the community with various community development organizations. Now, a lot of these organizations have been chosen or built to be a pillar in the community, and they're run by local people. And local elections are also a part of this as well. And you will see these local communities address the needs of the community. And so we found, for example, in Avondale, where we've done um, some presentations already, we've brought people together. We provide public transportation, and we have a series of seminars. And the idea behind it is we know that everybody can't make it to all of the series. So the idea is they're modular and you can move them around. If you go to one, that's great. You can still get some learning from it. And then we also have provided partnerships with local libraries that follow up on that, where we have graduate students who come in for a shift over the weekend, and people who either missed the lecture or learned something from the lecture can still come and have one-on-one time. So one example of that is I spent a great deal of time talking about how to update your devices, because a lot of people, that's a big privacy thing, is there are updates on the software that make your tools more private, and some people haven't updated their software in years and years, so they need to update it, and that takes hours that they have to update from Android 10 to 12, or something like that. So we work with them and making sure that it's a sustainability piece, not I'm just coming into a community and giving a lecture and then leaving. And then we build relationships. Okay, what does the community need next? A lot of that revolves around co-creation. So we're working in northern Kentucky, which is just 10 minutes away from Cincinnati. And we are applying for grants right now, and there's about nine organizations that are immigrant based, and they have expressed concern of understanding how AI may replace their jobs, and how to deal with privacy in their homes, and security and all that type of stuff. So we are working with them. They have community spaces. And the grant is for a co-creation activity. So before we even jump in and give a lecture as an example, you have to do co-creation, which is coming to the table saying, hey, we've identified that these are the things that you want to learn about. What is the best method to present these things to you? Obviously, it needs to be in Spanish for some of these communities. So we have English as a second language partners that will help make sure our presentations or can be easily converted into different languages as a base. And then we have to look with these community partners, okay, is it short form content? Is it long form content? Is it physical meetings? Is it within the classroom? What is the best way to help the people? And what is the target demographic that we work with? And so as we do that, that's the most important part, to then disseminate information that is relevant and culturally sensitive to them and culturally appropriate to them. So those are some examples of how we're out in the community.
Wow. Yeah, no, and that's so important. I mean, we see so many so many organizations that just pump information out and go, why is nobody reading it?
Right.
Definitely familiar with that problem. So we talked a little bit just now about the community, the education side of the issue.
Mhm.
This is what I was really excited to get into, is the sort of technology side of the problem.
Nice.
And so the reason I'm so excited about it is obviously, C4SS is an anarchist organization.
Mhm.
We don't love doing things by, regulation, by government fiat. Obviously, I think everyone recognizes that that is the world we still currently live in, and that some of these regulations are going to be better than others.
Yeah.
But I see a lot of potential in building technology that inherently considers privacy and is built with that in mind.
Mhm.
So one of the things you state on the Plunk Foundation site is
Mhm.
that Plunk aims to provide public domain, open source, audited, end-to-end encrypted, and zero knowledge technology. We refuse to collect information about the people who use it.
Mhm.
So the next thing I wanted to ask is, can you break down the various parts of this? What is zero knowledge technology? Why is it
Yeah.
important that it's open source? And tell us a little bit about, what's being developed in this area of technology.
Yeah, absolutely, Alex. So yeah, it's a mouthful. And a lot of privacy geeks and nerds, if you don't include, if you miss one of those inclusions, they'll be really upset. So and rightfully so, in my opinion. But yeah, so the public domain means that technology is available, sort of like Wikipedia. Like you can go to Wikipedia and you can look up something and it's there for you. The source where usually public domain is on GitHub, as an example, but can be found pretty much anywhere. But the idea is that unlike going through an app store or going through other means or by paying, as an example, you have access to the technology that Plunk will build. So that's one. Open source means the actual code is available for anybody to look at any time. And it's the live version of the code and it's always updated. So if we make a change in the code, anybody can see it. And that's really good for transparency's sake. The audited part is important because not everybody can read code and code is really difficult to get through. And when we are auditing, another reason why we've buttressed ourselves against a university is because we can have independent universities look and public universities look through the code. It can be a great thing for students to learn about privacy as well, and it can be managed by somebody with a PhD, as an example. But we want to have regular audits all the time, quarterly, as an example, maybe perhaps even more, depending on how we set that up. But there's also like Ernst & Young and Deloitte and other companies that do sorts of audits as well that we may want to go through. But the entire idea is that it's constantly and regularly looked at, so that if any changes that are made that are considered anti-privacy, or maybe there's just an accidental flaw in security or something, it can be addressed properly and instead of being exploited extremely easy. It also gives people an assurance from an authority, a third party authority other than us, that it is really what we say it is. Now, end-to-end encrypted. Now, end-to-end encrypted might not be happening for every technology that we create, but because of maybe some of the technological implications. But we would make that very clear. You would have like a label, like, hey, this, sort of like nutrition label, like, hey, these are the privacy implications, and here may be the drawbacks, as an example. But some things, end-to-end encrypted is between two parties by nature. So if there are multiple other parties, then we may have, some type of issue. But how end-to-end encryption works is, imagine Alex and I, we both live in one house. Okay, let's say we own the house, for example. Um, I would have a key and you would have a key. Okay, and that key is in our pockets as we go about our day. Now, the entire premise is that we are the only ones that have access to the house. Now, think about this. The analogy is that the house is a conversation, and the keys are the phones, and the key is actually just is stored on a physical thing. So it's a physical thing, just like a key. And so your phone has the key, and it hides the key, and the conversation can only be accessed if somebody has the key on the device. So what that means is that if somebody goes to the house, aka the message, they cannot get in because they don't have the key. And it's very similar that if somebody wants to hack you, they can try to get into the house, but they don't have the actual key. So they can see what the house looks like from the outside, but they can't get in to see what the contents are. How end-to-end encryption works is that if there is a breach, it doesn't matter because all the contents of that message seem to be gibberish. And they actually need the physical device to see the conversation. So it becomes extremely safe, unless, there are incidents of people losing their phones and getting that actual physical device or laptop at work stolen, which is a risk, as an example. Zero knowledge is a philosophy and concept that absolutely no information is collected about you. And I'll give an example of two different things, two different apps that regard this differently. So WhatsApp is considered end-to-end encrypted, and a lot of people think that it's, very safe and they collect minimal information about you, which is true before Facebook bought them in 2014. Since then, they have captured a lot of data that's outside of the messaging. So the messaging itself is encrypted and protected, but they often see who your contact list is, how you're using your phone in the various apps, and they're collecting that information on you. That would be not considered zero knowledge. The Signal Foundation, now, it used to collect a phone number confirm a device, but now it uses a username, but it doesn't collect any information about you. So if the feds come in and say, hey, we need information on this username on Signal, Signal can say, hey, I'm sorry, we actually don't even have any data in our servers that explains anything about these people. We have no idea. I think the only data point Signal has is when the account was created. And that's it, but it doesn't show from what phone, what location, any of those types of things. So that's the differentiator of zero knowledge. It's literally where the company building the technology has no idea about who the person is that's using the technology.
Nice. Yeah, I am a little bit familiar with Signal, and so that's interesting to hear that that's exactly what they mean when, you know, when people tout it as being a really safe alternative, a more private alternative.
Absolutely. I swear by it. It's the most amazing foundation ever.
Yeah, and I guess just a quick follow-up. So are there particular, like, you may not be at this stage yet, are there particular like products in development or specific pieces of technology that you're working on, or is this more recommendation for anyone developing new technology?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, in my history, as I was explaining before, I've developed technology and our team is really good at it. So we are raising money at the moment, to be able to do that. And to do so, we need to be sustainable. So we need at least 5 years of runway to hire a developer who will take a risk from a very good job to work with us at a competitive rate and give them, a 4-day work week, like things that we can do to um, compensate for the fact that they're losing out on yearly bonuses and maybe stock in company. As a nonprofit, you have to be more flexible and say, hey, we're going to give you the best insurance possible. We'll give you a 4-day work week, things like that. So as we're building this out, the initial cost for, building the team to build the technology, which we have several ideas of, and it would be based on the team how to prioritize, but it would be around $20 million for 5 years, so $4 million a year, and then having that sustainable runway to do so. We are in the middle of applying for grants with the NSF and various other organizations. We're also looking at private funding to continue that, but it will be a bit of a journey. I'm giving myself, our team is giving ourselves an 18-month window to raise that money. And then the production of the technology should be pretty easy because we're going to use a lot of open source libraries that already exist. It just takes experts, like very high level experts, to make sure that they can put those open source technologies together and then add a layer of privacy on it. And all of this stuff, we're not reinventing the wheel. All of this stuff kind of exists. You just need the implementation takes like a 1% of competent coders, like the top 1% of competent coders, to put that together. So it takes just a few extremely expert people to come together to make this happen.
I see. And you got to convince those extremely expert people not to take the higher paid gigs that don't care about privacy at all.
Yeah, or even convince them to, yeah, I mean, ideally it would be great to have them on payroll, but some of them may do this on the side. A lot of people in tech, they do it for the money, but they don't, their conscience doesn't sit well with them. So I believe a lot of them would be attracted to an opportunity like this, especially if it means that they're not getting hounded at work all the time or expected to run quarterly profits, and there's a lot less pressure for them and they are doing good in the community.
Nice. Well, I'm excited to see where that goes and, follow up as that develops.
Definitely.
After that, I wanted to turn to one concern I have. So earlier we were talking about, who's at risk from a lack of data privacy.
Yeah.
And you're saying we have this sort of consumer mindset where it's the person who's purchasing things is all we care about. But we also need to be concerned about families, about children.
Yeah.
And one concern I have is that we often see language around protecting children, around preventing human trafficking, and the need for data security in order to stop those things. One impact I see is that, so while this is a very real issue, right? Human trafficking, child welfare, these are real and important issues.
Yeah.
We often see these used as a political football to justify violations of digital privacy, to justify increased surveillance.
Yes.
And in general, to justify greater social control through this fear of like, oh, what's going to happen to my kids online? So I'm wondering if there are ways in which you're acknowledging or attempting to offset the risk of sort of, the risk of perpetuating this kind of fear and language around child welfare that, that we see. Most people, when they get concerned about it, they're like, okay, well, the only solution is to do mass surveillance, is to violate digital privacy.
Right.
And I guess I'm wondering, are there ways in which you guys are trying to, acknowledge these problems without feeding into that cycle?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think fundamentally, it is a war. It's like sort of a fear-mongering tactic, and that's kind of where I argue, like, hey, if you really do want to protect, then they should, like, children should have protections, like they should have privacy, because what's happening is we're seeing this with AI, is that a lot of people are able to target children who are, especially teenagers, with sextortion. They're able to find they can buy data, they can localize it, they can find vulnerable people based on social profiles that get analyzed by AI that spit out a report that say, hey, these people, may have a single family household income is lower, this, that, whatever, and have shown over time that their messages are related to depression and anxiety. And that's a target as an example. And you're able to now with $20 a month, some guy in a basement can target, their neighborhood very easily. And so I personally believe that if you want to protect, that privacy tools should be very easy. Now, in terms of using the language, is like if you're asking about like is Plunk using like fear mongering or whatever to, are you asking specifically about like should we drop the entire thing about helping children and stuff because it often is used as a like a political pundit too as well, like on both sides of the thing?
Yeah, so I kind of was thinking about it from both sides, right? Like,
Yeah.
if the solution is not mass surveillance, what is it? And I think you just gave us that answer, right? If we provide data privacy, you don't have to find the guy in his basement. You can, prevent him from getting that information to begin with.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, also like, when you talk about these things, is there certain language or terms, et cetera, that you use to avoid feeding into the fear mongering?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's another point I wanted to add because a lot of people who will say like, hey, the privacy, you know, you wouldn't be able to trace what happens or whatever. I'm working with a professor, her name is Chong Yu at University of Cincinnati, who has invented brilliant ways of being able to flag activity, especially some criminal activity, without invading the privacy based on um, very, this would not be zero knowledge, but there are some solutions that are able to understand online activity. Like if somebody, like Zoom calls, for example, are happening where in some rings of pedophilia that are on 24/7 and they, people log in and there are different things happening the entire time, but it's not the behavior of a normal person that's using a Zoom call as an example. And so there are various things that can detect like fake activity or like very abnormal behavior that can violate like a terms and conditions of something as an example. And so there's some things that are working on how do we preserve privacy, but also identify extremely dangerous things. And to be honest, it's pretty young, and Plunk's position is just, like, hey, we're more privacy absolutists. So the idea would be that I don't see us compromising in privacy for that regard. And that's just something we're gonna have to, there's a trade-offs for that, but that's something that we stand for and our team has really looked at deeply is that, hey, privacy is a human right, end of story. So that's one thing. Now, in terms of how to avoid the fear mongering and various things, um, I think that it's mostly about without blowing out of proportion how things are, but understanding the research behind what's going on. I don't think it's bad to say, hey, children are vulnerable and these are the stats as of why. Like we're seeing 20 suicides over the last, 12 months of sextortion, which is when teens have been solicited or they've been saying like, hey, like there are scammers that acquire news of a teen and then send it to the whole contact list as an example, unless they get money. And these things are ramping up at an exponential rate with AI, and parents aren't ready for those conversations because they don't know what's happening, and teens aren't telling their parents. And so when we talk about those statistics and various things that are happening and how it impacts families, and we're having the parents talk about their stories and sharing those experiences, and using it to drive policy, I think that's warranted rather than just saying like, hey, think of the children as terrible, all these, the sky is falling. But it's also, we focus a lot on, beyond children as well, because there are so many people whose rights are being violated, and there's various effects. And by sharing and being research based, and that's another reason we are anchored to a university, is that we want to make sure that we have research that logically shows the solutions to these things, instead of just saying, hey, empty your pockets because the sky is falling. So that's how we are working to be practical about it, but also um, be there to demonstrate the problem in a objective, or as close to objective way as possible.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that answer. I mean, I think something that will resonate with a lot of our audience is what you said about, children have a right to privacy too. A human right applies to children as well. And it's good to hear that there's, such a focus on, okay, what are the actual parameters of the problem?
Right.
Um, that that makes a lot of sense. So with that, I'm actually going to combine sort of these next two questions that I had on the outline.
Mhm.
So, one thing that's been, I think, on the mind of many Americans recently is the risk to women's autonomy in the wake of various state abortion bans. And
Yeah.
we're seeing things where, medical records and even period tracking apps can pose a potential threat
Mhm.
to rights and safety. And so I'm wondering, what do you see as being the biggest harms, the biggest impacts of bad data privacy around the world right now? And then we also talked a little bit about AI earlier, but are there, future risks on the horizon that we should be anticipating and thinking about now before they get here?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think I think to me the most profound invasiveness of privacy is Internet of Things related, and I'll go into that, as well as car related privacy. Um, Period tracking apps, yes, they are pretty bad. And I have actually looked into research on who is buying data tracking apps. I saw that Texas was the largest purchaser of them, but I can't find that article anymore. And so it's really hard for me to like
Mm.
quote the severity of it and be credible. Um, but yeah, I had it saved and I don't know where it is anymore. But definitely that is a worry, especially with the overturning of Roe v. Wade and how invasive the government is, because that is a blatant, it may, it affects every woman, but the cases are few at the moment, but the blatant surveillance and the boldness of which it's happening is extremely worrying, and the implications of that are pretty rough. Um, the way that I see is everyday stuff is Internet of Things related, because there's so many Alexa devices and Ring cameras and all of these types of things that will have AI integrated into them, and you're able to collect a ton of data beyond your phone. These devices do not they do not update. A lot of them are just like built very cheaply and quickly, and then there's a new version next year, and they don't provide updates for the older ones, which means it's a huge security flaw as well, and really easy to invade, rather than like a phone or computer that has regular updates. And I would add this to cars because the Mozilla Foundation came up with research. They went through 25 cars, and every single one of them was considered a privacy nightmare. 25 different types of cars. There are modems in cars which collect data and send it directly to the dealership. Instead of being useful for you for any sort of reason, there's another modem that's useful for you, as an example, that helps transfer data to your car to help, with your services in the car. It collects sexual history data and understands voice. There's cameras inside and outside of the cars, depending on the car. Those can identify streets and people and every passersby and all kinds of things, your driving habits, which can affect your insurance, as an example, because every metric of your driving habit is there. And I only see these things getting more and more invasive, from public cameras, and in smart cities, as an example, that are using outdated technology that's easily hackable from foreign intervention to. So I find all this to be extremely worrying. And then cars are just going full steam ahead with adding as much technology as possible. Cars, as you know, like Tesla considers themselves a software company, and that's really what it is. And I'm glad they're saying it. That's really what it is for all of these cars. And I feel like they're just going to get increasingly more creepy over time.
Yeah. Geez, is it Tesla that has the thing where they can like shut down your car remotely?
Yeah, and I think that was also in the news article about BMW. But I mean, pretty much every car company would have the ability to. Um, just by the way they've built their car and the app and who has access to things. So yeah, and it also has. I've I'm supporting a policy that I'm reaching out to the FCC with a few other organizations because this is often a huge problem with domestic violence, where the car can be controlled or stopped or tracked very easily, and your profiles on the car, and who has a key. All of those various things are huge problems in domestic violence incidents. And taking like, let's say you're dealing with that and your partner has a key or something, calling a company to disable that key or to submit an incident, they need extensive proof. And it's just like, now your car is basically your tracking device. You have to get rid of it, or you have to have a friend get you away from those situations. So it's becoming more difficult for a lot of survivors of abuse to get out of those situations.
Mm. Yeah, that's really scary to think about. I know I recently got a new car that has the push to start ignition instead of the actual key.
Yeah.
And even that freaks me out because I know you can fake the signal. So
Yeah. There's this really interesting talk about philosophy and developers, but there's this person I forget, but they wrote an article about like how the sometimes our inventions are just like, just because it's newer doesn't mean it's good. And specifically talks about car keys. They're like, okay, what if your fob gets wet or gets run over? It's done for, it costs more money, it doesn't do its job. But like a good old key can survive the weather, can survive getting ran over, and it will always work as long as it's intact. And making sure that if it's ever broken, that's pretty extreme. And the good old fashioned key is a way better invention than whatever's been created now. And there are things like that. Just because it might be more convenient or whatever, is it really better? Those types of questions.
right. Yeah, and I mean, how much more convenient is it?
Right.
Well, so I have a final question that I like to ask about book recommendations. But before I do that, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience about Plunk Foundation's work, um, privacy and tech, anything we didn't get to talk about through the other questions today?
No, I would just like to say, if you want to engage in any conversations or challenge what I've said, I think that's really important. I think that's how um, the Plunk Foundation will do better. And so if you ever want to reach out to me, Alex, I think maybe you might have my LinkedIn or something to share, but I'm more than happy to engage in conversations and, really have some honest discussions, because at the end of the day, the way I feel is that if Plunk no longer exists because the problem is solved, that would be amazing. If I wouldn't have to do this, that would be fantastic. I love helping people and I love the concept of privacy. But if we can eliminate this altogether, it'd be like having a food bank. And if nobody went hungry anymore, it'd be like, that's an enormous success. So let's talk and engage in ideas and, make the world better, increase social impact.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll include that. You said LinkedIn is the place to contact you.
Yeah, mostly. I have the other apps, but they're just like, usually I forget about them.
Fair. Yeah, well, I'll include your LinkedIn in the show notes then, and folks, if you have ideas, want to get involved, want to be part of this.
Yeah, and my email if people prefer email. Totally.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll put those both in the show notes then.
Excellent.
All right. And so my last question, I like to ask this just to kind of put an end cap on things.
Yeah.
Is there any book, and I know you you actually recommended us one earlier, so if there's other media, that's cool as well. But I usually ask, is there one book that you would recommend all of our listeners read?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a really interesting book that's pretty heavy, and the writer is kind of an asshole and makes you like want to disagree with him, but his points are really good. Is Nassim Taleb. He has written a few books. Um, the one that I like is related to the Black Swan, and I think he's done a really good job of articulating risk from a mathematical perspective, and it's one of those books that you just think about all the time, and it's kind of influenced the way I've thought, and I've really wrestled with it and like not liked it a lot of times, but I think those are some of the good books. Another, if you're interested in Eastern philosophy, is the Upanishads, which is sort of a secular version of the Vedas that's kind of boiled down into ways to look at the world. So those are two recommendations I have.
Wow, interesting. I love your description of Taleb.
Yeah.
He's kind of an asshole, but
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And you don't like him when you read it, but it was really formulative of like a lot of the way to think.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I've learned a lot actually, and had a really great time talking through, some of these problems and potential solutions for data privacy with you. I'm gonna look forward to seeing what comes out of Plunk Foundation in the future and how this work develops. And I'm really excited that people are thinking about these things seriously and working on this issue of data privacy. So thank you again. And with that, is there any last words for our audience?
No, thank you so much. You've been an excellent host, and the conversations beforehand have been delightful. So really appreciate all the work you're doing, and thank you for giving me the platform and opportunity to speak. Appreciate it.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. If you'd like to follow up with John on anything we discussed here, you can find him on LinkedIn or contact him via email at john@plunkfoundation.org. Both contact options are linked in the show notes below. And look out for another MER episode in June, in which C4SS scholar Nathan Goodman chats with Chris Coyne and Abigail Hall about their new book, How to Run Wars. The book is available from June 18th and presents a surprisingly humorous, satirical take on the military-industrial complex. Finally, if you haven't seen it yet, we do also have a new episode of Corey Massimino's The Long Library out this month. In this episode, Corey and Dr. Roderick Long discuss Roderick's 2013 essay, Eudaimonism and Non-Aggression. That episode can be found on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Patreon. On that note, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to those who support us on Patreon. None of this would be possible without your help, and I'm especially grateful to our producer-level sponsors. So here is a big thank you to Martin Jacobson, David Colborn, Michaela Maki, ASDF, Brady P., Jesse Posner, and Tatiana Whitaker. If you'd like to support this and all of our shows, please check out the Patreon at www.patreon.com/c4ss.org. That's C4SSDOTORG. Thanks.